What's up, all? This is Leon, the Paperback Maniac, here to bring you another vintage paperback horror novel review. Tonight, we are looking at The Voice of the Night by Brian Coffey, aka Dean Koontz. This book is actually the first Dean Koontz book I've ever read. I don't know why I always avoided picking his stuff up in the past. Part of me thought he was kind of horror light. Another part of me probably thought he was kind of a blowhard for so vehemently resisting the horror label, even though he quite clearly was writing horror novels, at least in his early career. And I do find it funny that although, he was so conflicted about writing horror and decried, being labeled as a horror writer, he was such good friends with Richard Lehman, who, if anyone has read, was one of the hardest horror writers out there. In fact, Koontz, Lehman, and Gary Brandner, the author of The Howling, were kind of like the West Coast horror triumvirate of the 80s. They kind of all hung out and, were buds. Although, of course, Koontz was miles ahead of them in mainstream popularity and sales. But anyway, this book, when I first picked this up in a used bookshop some years ago, I didn't know it was a Koontz book. Over his career, Koontz has used no less than, I believe, 8 different pen names. 8. So this is one of his earlier ones, I believe, Brian Coffey. He published a few other books under this name. And this edition I'm holding in my hands is the first paperback edition by Signet. It was published in 1981. The novel was first published in hardcover by Doubleday in 1980. And as the front blurb there tells us, it is a novel of adolescent evil. It's actually a lot more than that, I'll tell you right now. It's also a coming-of-age story. It's a treatise on good and evil. It's a story about fear, and perhaps most pointedly, it's a book about alienation. So I will begin by reading the back cover synopsis. Colin and Roy, 2 California teenagers. Colin was shy and bookish, just finding out about girls. Roy was handsome, outgoing, athletic, with a string of conquests. No one could figure out why these two chose each other as best friends. No one could guess the games they found to play together and the nightmare they were creating between them. No one could stop them. All right, so at first blush, this book would appear to fall under that category of stories of unlikely friendships. And that's one that I've always dug. Think of a movie like 1990's Bad Influence with James Spader and Rob Lowe, I believe, for an example of that, where you have kind of like a straight-laced guy who kind of becomes friends with sort of like an edgier, darker character who changes his life in some way. So in this one, we've got Colin and Roy. Colin is a new kid in the seaside town of Santa Leona. He's recently moved to this California coastal town with his mom over the summer after a nasty divorce. And as the synopsis tells us, Colin is, he's timid, he's shy, he's kind of a little geeky. He likes geeky things like SF and horror comics. He loves monster movies. And he's a follower. He's a follower. His leader is Roy. Now, Roy is everything that Colin wishes he were. Roy is handsome. He's outgoing. He's popular. He's athletic. All the girls want to date Roy. All the guys want to be Roy, including Colin. Colin worships Roy. In fact, in the month since he's moved into town, he just can't believe that Roy would choose him to be his friend. And they almost exclusively are hanging out together, just the two of them. Colin can't believe his luck. And, he just wishes that he could be like this guy. Now, for all of Roy's ostensible charm and sort of outward perfection, it's very clear from the beginning that something is very, very wrong with this kid. The novel actually gets off to a very ominous start in the very first scene where Colin and Roy are sitting on a hill overlooking the Pacific, and Roy asks Colin if he's ever killed anything. And then he admits to Colin that he likes to kill bugs. He likes the way they squish. And then he quickly goes on from there to say that he's, killed other things, bigger things for fun. Mice, even a cat with his mother's knitting needles, just because there was nothing better to do. And you're thinking, like, what the fuck, is this kid like one of the strangers? He calls these experiences poppers. He says, ooh, it was a real popper, killing one of these things. Now, later in the book, when you learn the provenance of that term popper and what it really means, it's really fucked up. But Colin doesn't really give much credence to these things. He shrugs it off as boyish bravado, even when in like the second or third page of the book, Roy admits then to having actually killed a couple of kids. He takes it even further. He says he killed some kids because they betrayed him. They didn't want to be blood brothers with him. He has this thing of blood brotherhood. He actually cuts the palm of his hand, and he convinces Colin to cut his hand, and they kind of merge the hands together so that the blood commingles, and that bonds them for life as blood brothers. Clearly, this was early in the 80s, before the AIDS epidemic kind of swept the nation. But even then, Colin is, not buying it. He says, hey, you're just stringing me along. You're trying to creep me out. You're trying to gross me out. Even though the entire time from page 1, Roy is adamant that he's telling the truth. And he says, no, like, I really do want to do these things. And he tries to convince Colin to join him in doing these things. He also, early on in the book, so there's early in the novel, he takes Colin to his house and shows Colin his father's very impressive model railroad, which takes up like the entire garage. And he runs the railroad, he runs the toy trains, and then he purposefully crashes them, and then he kind of bends down and looks at the toppled carriages, inspecting it, trying to find dead bodies. And he tells Colin, he says, well, if this were a real accident, oh man, they'd be all busted up and split open inside, and there would be blood splashed on the walls. And you really, the reader, you wonder what the hell is Colin thinking? Why does he not question some of this and think, man, this guy is really showing signs of, like, something's definitely wrong with this kid. But then at the same time, also, I, like myself, I remember Adolescence. I remember, not being someone who always had a whole lot of friends. I remember, wanting to hold on to friendships, especially if it's with someone who you think is like out of your league. And, Colin's biggest fear is that Roy is going to ditch him. He thinks, maybe he's going to come to his senses one day. He doesn't feel worthy. He's very, the novel does a great job of kind of getting at that adolescent insecurity and that fear of rejection and, non-acceptance. And so, he doesn't want to mess this up. Even, he's like, okay, maybe this guy's a little weird. He says weird things occasionally, but, he's still the most popular kid in school. He's like the golden child. I'm lucky to be his friend. So, he's a 14-year-old, so you got to remember that. So, you give him the benefit of the doubt, even though progressively, Roy acts stranger and stranger and says some truly dark things. And he is very manipulative, this Roy. He says all the right things. He's a smooth talker with parents and with Colin. He tells Colin in secret, he says that you and I, we are unlike anyone else. He said, the reason that I like you is because you're smart like me and you get me. And we're into the important stuff in life. We are concerned with the things that matter, the only things that matter, which are namely pain and death. And, Roy has very interesting thoughts about this. He says that death is the most important thing in the world because all of life revolves around death. And in fact, everything can kind of go back and be all of the inadequacies and weaknesses of a person kind of go back to a fear of death. And if you can conquer your fear of death, all the other smaller fears will be erased, and no one can bring you down, including your parents. And, this is sort of appealing to Colin, actually, because, for one thing, he's very emotionally distant from his macho father, who lives back down in LA. He never kind of understood his father. And even his mom, with whom he's moved up to this new town, she's lately had really been busy with work and really has shown him very little affection. So he's not really getting any sort of love at home. And, so he's easily kind of swayed by these words. And so Roy says, you need to conquer death, and then you will be unconquerable. And how do you conquer death? Well, to become familiar with death. How do you become familiar with death? Well, you start by killing things. Animals could be a start, but then we could move on to bigger things. And Roy has some ideas. He has some interesting ideas of things that Colin and he can do over the summer. And it's quite troublesome. So this novel definitely is a slow burn at the start. The first half of it, definitely a coming of age story. Koontz definitely takes the time to build up the characters wisely, because then in the second half, when it sort of it does kind of an about face and changes from this sort of darkly quiet coming of age story into a taut and immensely creepy thriller. But because that the author has taken the time to sort of really establish these characters, you really, really care for them. And you really care that, especially Colin, you really care that he, makes it out alive. And I have to say that personally, I loved the character of Colin. I thought I related to this character more than I've related to an adolescent character in any fiction I've read in quite a while. As a kid whose parents had divorced when I was young and who sort of didn't see that as a bad thing, I'd never really read about that before. I always thought I was sort of a freak. And, as a kid who never really could relate easily with his dad and sort of saw this separation as a sigh of relief to get away from the dad, it really struck a chord with me, So yeah, Colin was, and he's a smart kid, and the fact that he loves horror and all this stuff, I really cared for this guy a lot. And so the scenes in the latter half of the book where he is in peril, just some real nail biters. I mean, there's a cat and mouse scene in an abandoned junkyard that really just one of the most taut and gripping scenes I've read, because I cared so much for the character. It really shows you that, to have an effective novel, the characters do need to be there. I mean, as you guys, if you've seen my videos, I don't need that necessarily. I read a lot of pulp trash that, has just expendable characters. But Koontz definitely takes it a step up, and that's probably why he saw so much mainstream success, along with Stephen King, another person who really took the time to develop characters that you cared about. It shows, the separation between, these kind of guys and the guys who were just writing the stuff about, the gore and the violence. So yeah, this one, really well done. There were, some things that were a little annoying. For instance, when Colin goes to his mom for help, when he's practically begging his mom for help, this woman who's been showing him very little attention anyway, her reaction was just, it was infuriating, to say the least. And at first, I was kind of annoyed, and I thought, Koontz, you dropped the ball with this character. This is just unbelievable. Why would you make the mom such an unbelievable, callous bitch? But then I stopped and I thought, wow, wait a minute. This is genius. By doing this, by having the mother react the way she did, it really places the reader's empathy directly with Colin. And it allows the reader to experience exactly the way a teenager would feel when he or she is trying to communicate with an adult who just doesn't understand and just isn't listening. And, because we're getting all this, I mean, it's mostly through Colin's point of view. So I thought it was actually brilliant to do that, because you feel the way Colin feels, like, what the hell? Listen to me. This is so unjust. What are you doing? Help me. I'm in danger, right? It was just masterfully done. It was really, really well done. Also, the writing here was impressive. Koontz has some, beautiful prose when describing, the night, and, especially the attendant noises of the night, or voices of the night, as it were. Really nice little details. He does have a tendency in this book, and I don't think this is a common thing of his style, but in this book, he would have these really long passages of just straight dialogue. It would be these long tracts of unbroken dialogue, or just be like back and forth. Character said this, character said that, for like a page or two. That got a little annoying, frankly, but that's a personal thing, just because I don't really care that much for dialogue. I mean, obviously dialogue is necessary, but it's not like, I'm more of a prose and sort of description kind of guy. So I found it felt like kind of like reading a screenplay at times with just all the dialogue. But the dialogue was good, and it did convey character well. So there was that. But yeah, this book was very well done. As I mentioned, a lot more than simply a novel of adolescent evil. It's a meditation on sort of the pain and the fear of adolescence, the terror of adolescence. Really gets at what it's like to be, a teenager and just feel like you have absolutely no one in the world to turn to. You feel like you're alone in this universe, this cold, dark universe. No one's going to help you. And that right there is, that's the terror. That's real. The true horror of this book actually comes, there's a scene, there's a point at which Colin, where he's kind of at this really, at his nadir, and he has the conviction that absolutely no one, not even his own parents, know him well enough to truly, be able to help him. They just don't know him, and they can't help him at all. And it's a terrifying conviction. And if you think about it, for a 14-year-old kid to come to that realization, it's just an awful realization. But yeah, give this one my highest recommendation, guys. This is a Dean Koontz book. It's been reprinted probably, at least 50 times. This is not hard to find. Check it out. If you're like me, if you've resisted Koontz, I feel like this is a good one to start with. I have a few other Koontz books from around this time that he wrote under other names. I'm definitely going to read them. So yeah. So hope you enjoyed that. Stick around. I'm going to be hopefully doing another collection video probably soon. Next month, May. I've got a really fun thing planned, so stay tuned for that. There's going to be some cool stuff coming up. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Take it easy. I will catch you later. Peace out.